I will say, at first, we had such high hopes for Leonard. But then right away, there were issues.
Okay, but when we switch to the new plan, I'll still be covered?
The whole company will, even janitorial.
No! I want my idea!
What idea?
That we don't do that!
What do we do instead?
Well, not that! How come janitorial has all that health stuff? They don't even have cool ties.
I don't see how that...
I'm shutting down the company.
Okay, you can't just shut down the
La
company.
la 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 la. Shutting down the company for a month. I still get paid.
He can't just do that, right?
Well. The company bylaws are, well, they're weird.
Jesus. Are you okay?
No, it's insane.
We need to get rid of that thing.
No, can't. Has to be unanimous. Microwave stays.
But it's dangerous.
No one wants it here.
He gave me money, and he may also give me a job when I leave here. So tough titties.
All right, everybody, this is Bob. He's going to help us untangle those legal issues so we're not waiting on key decisions.
I hate Bob!
What? Why?
Because you chose him! I want a cool boss that'll pick someone that, that I like.
Okay, well, some of our clients can...
I'm not letting anybody meet Bob, so no one look at Bob. Huh? Nobody look at Bob.
Okay, there's no way he has the authority to do that.
I saw you looking.
What the?
Science isn't in the Bible! This frightens and arouses me. I am the boss of you. I'm the boss of your whole body. You need to know what's going on in there. Where's the cake? Bring me the cake, or I'll wish you into the cornfield.
Well, the thing is, Leonard,
You can't do anything to me or my cool tie.
see, we all got together and we voted.
Oh,
I do not care what you think about that last part of the season. That song's still awesome. I still immensely enjoy it. Maybe that's probably the most controversial thing I said this entire class. That's the one I get the most emails about. That I don't care what you feel about the finale. That theme song is still cool. So welcome to another edition of the class. We're this week talking about the legislative branch, and I lied to you all before when I said that the Constitution section was going to be the longest. This is going to be the longest one. And I was looking through everything again, and mostly just because I just forgot. And I looked through everything again, and I was like, oh, wait, I forgot how long the legislative branch one is. It's just so long. It takes a long time to really get through and really discuss why this is the way it is. And I really do think that this is at least intended to be the most influential branch. And unfortunately, in our modern world, it really doesn't get the necessary power that it probably should or was designed to get. The case now is that the legislative branch still holds a lot of power, but there are some things that it might need to start taking back that has given up to presidents. And now that we currently have a president in power who on the outside doesn't really care about restraint or restraint to his own power, we're starting to see that he's taking a lot of advantage of it. There has been some argument that maybe the legislative branch should take back more power. And what would that entail? How would they be able to do that? We're going to go through a lot. There's a lot of issues that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about law, what is law, the legislature itself and how it's structured, going through the different parts of the Constitution that lay out its powers. We also talk about the representatives themselves, the type of influences they have, the type of party accountability they have, the term limits that they have, and the House of Representatives itself and the structure of the leadership in the House of Representatives. Then we go through the Senate and actually how that's structured and how they do stuff, because they're very different styles of government. The legislative branch is consistent of senators who really have more power, more influence compared to the House of Representatives, but the House of Representatives has their own balancing act that they really do need to maintain. We talk about the powers of impeachment that the Congress does have under the Constitution, and we kind of look through everything and see how it all functions. I'm going to try as best I can to get through these without going into too much detail. I do not know how long this thing is going to end up being. It is really important. I mean, this is not something where you can just go through this lightly. And on top of that, too, the good thing is that I also will provide a video that will be different in that it will lay out the actual modern day leaders in the legislative branch that can give you guys kind of an overview of what is currently going on. Since it changes so often, I usually don't include that in this video, so that way it can be timeless almost. Hopefully you guys can watch the second video, which will give you more insight into what is currently going on in the legislative branch, who the main leaders are, and the power structure and how it works. So to get started, obviously the main power of the legislative branch is to legislate, and that is to make laws. So what is law? What we talked about in the judicial branch was about the ideas of law and order and how law and justice is carried out, but you actually have to make laws before you can carry out justice, and you have to form a society, and that's where the legislative branch really does contribute to that formation of society. First, it's about survival, in the survival and customs of law. In order to make sure society survives, they need to have some sort of structure and law, and things need to be a little bit clear and actually written down, and that's where the first ideas of law really came into practice. It also sets up customs for each society and how they are supposed to interact with each other, what they are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do. There are a lot of things that we legislate that really just come down to tradition and customs. It also makes this idea of a nation state, that each individual country is allowed to make their own laws and set their own principles, that when you go into another country, you are expected to uphold the laws of that country that you are in. It's a lot like the judicial branch in that it also follows the ideas of natural law, which is based off of reason. It also has a little bit of religious law and setting the tone with the Ten Commandments, and also just customs in general that the Bible set forward, and different types of religions also to set the precedent for how their people in that religion is supposed to act. Same sort of thing when you are a member of the United States. You are supposed to act in a certain way and abide to certain customs. And this is part of the growing idea of the social contract theory that Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau had all debated as well. And this comes from the idea that man had created legislatures as society evolved. They were free to practice their own government. If they were free to practice their own religion and their own ideas and beliefs, they were also allowed to practice their own legislature and government and really to govern themselves. And it's part of man's evolution, society's evolution, to really make these legislatures to help themselves legislate. A legislature is a department or assembly of a body or persons that make a statutory laws for a state or a nation. At the federal level and in most states, legislatures are bicameral, which means that there are two separate houses in each legislature. So obviously bicameralism comes from the word from two, which is bi, that first part of it, is a British heritage. It primarily comes from the ideas of Parliament. Parliament has the upper chamber, which is the House of the Lords, and the lower chamber, which is the House of Commons. But unlike in the United Kingdom, the House of the Commons actually has more power than the House of the Lords. In the United States version, the Senate usually has more power than the House of Representatives in some fashion, because senators are just more established. But there are more power given to the lower house in the UK system, and that's just because it's a parliamentary system. And as we said before, the names of the two houses in the United States are the Senate and the House of Representatives. Their primary function is to make laws. That is their basic function that they have all the time. That is just to make laws, and how they make laws, what laws they make, how they go about it are really up to them and whoever's in charge. They also have quasi-judicial powers because they are allowed to impeach. And when we talk about impeachment, we're going to talk about how that is not only just a legislative affair, it is an actual trial of whoever they're impeaching, whether it's a president, whether it's a Supreme Court justice, whoever it might be, they can have the power to impeach that person. So in Article 1 of the Constitution, this is what lays out the powers of the legislative branch. And in Section 1, it talks about bicameral structure. And again, it just lays out the ideas that there is a Senate and there is a House. In Section 2, it talks about the House of Representatives and how they have 2-year terms, their requirements for office and what they are. You have to be at least 25 years old, a citizen of the United States for the past 7 years, and be at the time of election an inhabitant of the state that they represent. Those are the only qualifications that you need in order to run for the House of Representatives. In that section, it also talks about the appointment of taxation and representatives, and also the selection of the leadership in the House, which we're going to go over in a little bit. Section 3 talks about the Senate and the number of terms and terms of senators. So each state gets 2 senators, and they serve for 6-year terms. And this was kind of an issue for a while because state legislatures would choose the senators, and people might not agree with that choice. They wanted more of a say in it, even though they elected those elected representatives from the states as well. That was not what they really wanted. They wanted to have a direct election of their senators. And now the 17th Amendment is what has changed that. That was ratified in 1913. And now, so we directly vote for senators in each state. It also talks about the requirements for senators. So they have to be at least 30 years old. They must have been a citizen for the United States for the past 9 years or longer. And they must be inhabitants of the states that they seek to represent at the time of their election. So similar to the other to the House of Representatives, you just need to be 30 for this instead, and have 2 more years as an immigrant into the United States and a citizen of the United States. As long as you have those 2 things, you're good. It also discusses the role of the vice president. The role the vice president has in the Senate is almost like an overseer of the entire Senate. Sometimes the vice president even gets a vote, and there was a very recent issue like that where there was a big fight about the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. She really was not really well liked by many senators, and there was a 50-50 split, and the Vice President, Mike Pence, had to vote her into office, and he actually got to have a vote. It was one of the first times in a long time that he actually had to vote. Biden, I think, got to do it a couple times. But if there is a split 50-50 in the Senate, the vice president does get to vote on that bill. So they can be a really tight vote. And in a really closely contested Congress, in a closely contested Senate, this can really be an issue for some people where they get that extra vote. And it depends who's in the executive branch to really put out that power. The vice president's job used to be every day to look over the Senate. This was like their only real job that they had. When we get to the executive branch, we'll talk about the role of the vice president and how it's changed over the years. This is a really important role for the vice president, and sometimes it really wasn't a role for many years. Like, people always said that the role of the vice president was a bunch of like crap. Really, it really wasn't that great of a role. The president pro tempore is the person who is the longest serving senator for any party, and they automatically become one of the people in line for the presidency as well. If the president was shy, it goes the president, obviously, where if he dies, it's the vice president, and then it's the Speaker of the House, and then it's the president pro tempore of the Senate who becomes 4th in line. So they really have their powers are more lie in the senator stuff. There's some ideas that they have that get through, and they have some power, but honestly, it's kind of a in name only recognition. The Senate also has the power to try impeachment cases. So impeachment could start in the House, and then it gets to the Senate, and the Senate will actually be the ones who vote and go to trial over something. And this has only happened like a handful of times, not even a handful, which is a pretty remarkable thing. It had never happened before, and it hasn't happened since, where there was a full trial of the Senate. We'll talk about that more later, but really a super fascinating moment in the United States that there was actually an impeachment trial. Section 4 talks about the election of Congress, their meeting requirements of Congress, when they're supposed to meet, how often they're supposed to meet, all that other stuff. Section 5 talks about bicameral rules. It talks about internal elections, adjournments, and talking about basically taking records, when they're supposed to adjourn for breaks, and then keeping records of everything. And record keeping was especially important for people because they wanted to see what was going on in their own elected representatives, and they wanted to know who voted for what at any time. So that way, if somebody who was their representative, they disagreed with them, they can always go back and say, I disagree with your vote and how you voted on this. That still happens now. There's an absolutely effective way to keep records of everything that happens on the House floor or Senate floor at all times. Section 6 is rights of the legislatures. It talks about their compensation and how much they make. In the House of Representatives, they actually only make $174,000 a year, which is a lot. It's a good living for sure. But that's all that they make. They don't make anything more than that. And senators actually only make $174,000 a year. I thought they were two different salaries. They actually do make the same. That has obviously changed over the course of the years, and they can make their own salary. But they don't get paid that much. They get paid in other ways, and then we'll talk about what those are. Definitely. So they make enough money where they're fine to live off of, but their primary salary, probably for a lot of them, they're rich, so they probably don't really rely too much on that salary. It also talks about their privileges and immunities, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. Section 7 is basically talking about how a bill is passed. This lays out that the president must sign every bill, no matter what it is. It's the presentment clause. The president has a couple of different options when they are presented with a bill. They can either pass the bill by signing it, they can veto it if they wanted to. This happens quite often. Or right now, especially, there's times, though, where like a president will outright say, I'm not going to sign that. So now the Senate and the House won't pass a bill unless they know it's going to be signed. That happens a lot if there's a pretty good chance that it's not going to get signed and they just have it there sitting. Sometimes presidents will just say, I'm not going to sign that, and they just won't go forward with it. A president can also not sign a bill, but wait 10 days and let it pass. So some presidents will do this out of protest if they really don't agree with the law. They're not going to sign it into law, but it will still become law. Even though they don't agree with it, it will still become that. So they have to wait 10 days in order to do that. Now, the Senate and the House also have the ability to override a veto of the president. It is not set in stone unnecessarily when a president vetoes a bill. The procedure to override the veto has to start in the chamber of the authorship. So if Congress overrides a veto by a two-thirds vote in each house, it becomes law without the president's signature. Otherwise, the bill fails to become a law unless it is presented to the president again and the president chooses to sign it. Historically, the Congress overrides the president's veto 7% of the time. So this is not uncommon for this to happen. If a bill is really going to get forward, I don't remember the last time this really happened, but if Congress is really set in stone about something, that they want something to be passed, they can go to the president and say, we're going to override your veto if you do veto this bill. It has to start so if a bill started in the House, it needs to start there, and they need to override the veto on that. And then if they pass that override, it goes to the Senate, and they too need to get 2/3 of senators in order to pass the bill into law, and it automatically becomes law after that. They do not need to get signed by the president. There's a last way to veto something, and that's called a pocket veto. And the Congress, by their adjournment, prevents its return, in which the case it shall not become law. So if Congress is set to go on break at a certain point, and the president really doesn't want to sign a bill, if they pass it, they have to make sure that the president can't use this pocket veto where they can go to break and then the law, it's not going to become law at all. They're adjourned, so they can't do anything about it. This is why a lot of legislation will come before breaks, so that way they get it signed, and then this pocket veto can't be used. It's only been used a handful of times, but basically, if Congress goes on adjournment and the bill isn't signed, it does not become law. Section 7 also has another part where they talk about the reservation of rights and the signing of statements. That is, they can sign the law, and that is the statement itself that the president has, and enters it into the Federal Register too. That every law is passed is entered into the Federal Register, so that way people can go and check on it or see what the law actually states. Sometimes presidents will also make a statement saying that they will not uphold or enforce a law because they consider it to be an infringement on their powers. Again, only happens a rare amount of times. If they actually sign something, they're just say, I'm not going to enforce this. But that, again, is part of their rights in order to do that. Section 8 is enumerated powers. And the first one that is an enumerated power of Congress is to declare war. And there have only been 5 times in which Congress has officially declared war. And that is the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. Those are the only times that we have officially declared war. That kind of puts into perspective like how many wars we've had but have not actually had a fully declared war. That rarely ever happens, and sometimes it's really like kind of awful that we've not had a full declaration of war in a very long time, but still have all these wars that we are a part of. They give congressional authority in order to go to war sometimes. That is certainly part of what Congress did in Afghanistan and Iraq. They signed off on it because they said it was totally fine, but there was not an official declaration of war. They funded it, they did everything that they needed to do, but there wasn't this fully congressional statement saying that we are going to war. Part of that was because of just who we were fighting. Same thing in Vietnam, and Korea, and all these other places too, where we fight these wars quite often, but we don't officially declare it in Congress. Part of that is just because it's easier to really just go to war and start, and then it just happens. War is a snappy event, so debating it and going to different congressional stuff and committees can be really taxing. Section 8 also lays out implied powers of Congress. That it doesn't explicitly lay out certain things, but there are certain implied powers that Congress has. That is to make laws which should be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So that's the necessary and proper clause, that any time Congress feels that it is necessary and proper for them to make a law or to declare themselves the power over something, they have that power. Implied powers are derived from the necessary and proper clause, and these powers are not stated specifically, but they are considered to be seasonally implied through the exercise of delegated powers. And this really comes down to time and evolution of government and society, that we give certain powers to the executive, we give certain powers to the legislative branch, and we give certain powers to the judicial branch. And as our government has grown and these institutions have grown, they all have certain powers that they are in charge of, and certain things that they know they're not going to have power over unless there's oversight over it. Section 9 lays out the rights of the people. So this is kind of making sure that there's certain things that the government cannot do. And that first one is habeas corpus. And that is the privilege and the writ of habeas corpus should not be suspended unless and when it is a case of rebellion or invasion of public safety may be required of it. And the right of habeas corpus is when a person is arrested, they are to be brought before a judge or in a court, especially to secure a person's release from unlawful grounds, are shown for their detention. So you have to have some reason you are being arrested. You have a right to go before a judge and state your case. Those are the rights that you have. If you are accused of something, you are allowed to try to fight that accusation. It literally means you have the body, habeas corpus, and that's Latin for you have the body. The defendant is being unlawfully held and deprived of his rights. The body must be produced by the state upon writ, and they must be afforded due process to determine guilt. And that's basically, this is laid out in Amendments 1 through basically 13, that all people have due process and rights, that there's a bunch of things that they're allowed to do that are specifically stated under the Constitution. This basically tested the legality of imprisonment and saying that Congress wasn't allowed to suspend this person's belief. They have to go through the judicial branch in order to make sure that they are brought before and serve justice, that Congress is not allowed to be the one who serves justice, basically. They are allowed no ex post facto laws. So, for example, we have a lot of issues with revenge porn and things like that, that there have been laws over the past couple of years that have prevented people who are in a prior relationship using certain photos, information, things like that, that would be horrible to use against their significant others, and basically use it to blackmail them. Those laws have now been passed, but before that, it was not necessarily illegal to do that. That it was still horrible, but it was not necessarily a law that was illegal to do. Now that the laws are passed, that does not mean that they can go and search for those people and charge them with a crime, because that was not technically a law when they committed those crimes. Now, anytime after that, if they commit those same crimes, then they can be tried and brought to court. But before that, if they have no proof that they committed any crime after those laws have been put in place, they cannot try them. So they can't just put in laws and say, well, we don't like that. And, for some stuff, it's pretty good that you don't want to have a Congress that just makes a law all of a sudden, and then now it's illegal to do that, and then they go charge you with it. So this is basically saying anything that becomes a law, after that point, that's when you can actually go and charge people for a crime. Section 9 also lays out the proportional taxation, talking about the census for every 10 years, that they are in charge of putting a census together every 10 years and seeing how the population has changed. They are part of districting and gerrymandering, which we're going to talk a lot about gerrymandering when we talk about voting in political parties. It talks about congressional districts and how they are laid out. We right now have 435 representatives in the House of Representatives and 100 senators in the Senate. And that has been like that for the last couple of years, at least since we added a couple states in. But the amount of representatives also will shift and change based off of how the districts are laid out. It also lays out that there's no preference and equity under the laws for all states. So they cannot make a specific law for each state. So let's say the Alabama abortion bill, for example. They cannot outright just say Alabama is not allowed to pass this abortion bill. They cannot do that because that is singling out one state and is not equity under the law. You need to make sure that if you make a law that it applies to every single state and that every single state has to follow it. It's not just certain states can't follow certain laws. It's a way to keep things equal. And if you have a Congress that is really kind of anti a certain state, it makes sure that a lot of states can't just band together and like attack one state. It's trying to keep a unity amongst everybody. They are not allowed to take money from the Treasury without an appropriations bill. This is just protecting against people taking money from all over the place. And there are no titles of nobility, so they can't call them the king of whatever or sir whatever. They really do call them Mr. Congressman, Mr. Senator, Mr. President. There's a reason for that. It's because the Mr. implies that they are a normal person, but with a really important job. Section 10 talks about state limitations, and the state legislatures cannot do what this article has outlined as responsibilities of the Fed, so there's certain things that they're not allowed to do. They're not allowed to make their own treaties, they're not allowed to make their own coin money, and they're not allowed to tax other states. So everybody has to follow under these federal guidelines. This is why it's one specific area for the Constitution and what they lay out, that they are not allowed to make their own treaties, that they are not allowed to make their own coin money. If they did that, that can really cause an issue with the economy, especially now. So the actual representatives, what do they do? How do they do it? You either serve 2-year terms or 6-year terms. So obviously if you're a senator, you're serving for 6 years. If you're a representative, you're serving for 2. There are a couple of different styles of a legislature, in both the Senate and in the House Representatives. There's one, the delegate. And that represents a district as a delegate and usually votes predictably on the issues near to the heart of the district. And it may split on issues depending on the party. There may be certain things that, like, we have a representative, Ami Bera, who really does probably represent a pretty middle ground of Elk Grove, Folsom, and a couple other places, because Sacramento tends to be pretty 50-50 split when it comes to Democrats and Republicans. The inner city itself is pretty liberal, but the outer part of the city tends to be more Republican, and that sometimes shifts. But, it really does depend. The delegate but there could also be a delegate from a very southern state. Most of the southern states tend to be more Republican, and especially in big Republican areas, they tend to vote pretty solidly along the lines of what they think their constituents are going to do. Same thing with liberal states. In San Francisco, for example, Nancy Pelosi tends to vote more liberal. And she's pretty a liberal person as it is, so she tends to vote with how her party and her district pretty much think. There's also someone called a trustee, and that's a representative who chooses to either vote with his judgment as a trustee of his constituency or to vote along party lines of the district lines. So this is almost an adherence to the party's goals. You have to keep in mind that, like, when somebody is a Democrat or Republican, a lot of their funding comes from the party, not just from their district members. So the money that they have to run and vote kind of depends on how their party is going to vote as well. The last one is called a politico, and this is a combination of styles usually. They may vote as a delegate and or a trustee by his characterization or by their willingness to make deals to achieve goals. And this is somebody who kind of uses the wheels of politics and knows it pretty well in order to kind of make their own judgment on what they think is going to be the best way to achieve their own personal goals. They're usually known as a wheeler and dealer, somebody who can make really good deals, try to make sure that they are actually working with one another across the aisle. Sometimes it takes bipartisanship in order to do that. And bipartisanship, if you ever hear that word, is when they are able to make deals with other party members or people from another party. So they're able to make friendships and forge lines and try to come up with some common ways that they can solve some issues. Sometimes politicos can be a really good tool. Sometimes they can be a really damaging tool. Representatives definitely have a lot of interest, and they have a lot of things to consider when they are voting. They have re-election considerations. I mean, obviously, they don't probably want to lose their job unless they quit just outright. So they really do have to think about their re-election chances and what are the things that are going to look good when they do vote and have to go back to their constituents and talk about why they voted for something a certain way. They have to think about money for re-elections. If they constantly are saying things that don't really make people think that they're that electable, then they're probably not going to get money in order to run again. They're going to lose people in the bigger business stuff. If you run a very anti-business campaign, you're probably not going to get a lot of money from a lot of big business donors. That's why you don't see it that often, because a lot of the money that comes from is from billionaires, from millionaires. But if you're saying, I want to tax the billionaires and millionaires, are they going to give you money? Probably not. So that's why you don't see a lot of people like in the Democratic primaries and things like that who say, like, even though they might believe it, they really have to portray themselves as kind of middle of the road on certain things. And this is something that they really have to consider. There's also interest groups and lobbies. Lobbying is a huge part of congressional life. And lobbying really just means that they have lobbyists come in and they try to lobby them to vote on a bill a certain way. And lobbyists can either be a good or a bad thing too. There are certain lobbyists who work for oil companies, who work for all this stuff. You hear all about that sometimes, how lobbyists are ruining Washington. Well, lobbyists are a part of Washington. And there are a lot of good lobbyists too. They lobby for like firefighters, they lobby for 9/11 victims, they lobby for a whole bunch of different things. You can hire lobbyists to really do whatever you want. Interest groups also play a huge factor. The NRA is a huge interest group. President Trump, you see it from him. He always talks about how he wants to pass background checks, and then he talks to the NRA, who kind of threaten him with like some sort of election stuff, and he comes back and he's like, oh yeah, like I didn't really mean background check stuff. That is an interest group playing their influence into a re-election of a certain political leader. They also have to take into account the political party that they're a part of. If you are a part of the Democrats and you consistently vote against Democratic policies, the party's probably not going to keep you around. They're not going to have you in because they don't like the way that you're voting. This is why certain people like Ami Bera are, for many people who are their representative in Elk Grove and Folsom and all that area, he's very middle of the road, but sometimes he'll vote against Democrats, and it kind of makes people mad, and they'll kind of will sometimes probably threaten whether they actually want to continue to fund his campaigns, and maybe just bring somebody else in there who might vote more along the lines of what they think. They also have to keep into account, like if you vote along Democratic principles and you also work your way up into the rankings, you can actually earn leadership positions, and we'll talk about what those leadership positions are. There are committee chairmanships, they're a huge leadership position, and they hold a lot of power. And also your colleagues, too. If you're working with people and you're voting a certain way and you really let your opinions known, they're probably not going to like you maybe, or maybe some people might. Especially in Congress, you know how that person is voting. Like, that you know what they're going to do. You know how they vote and what they think. And you really get to know them really well. And I'm sure if you've ever worked in an environment like that, if somebody lets you know their opinion all the time, you start to form your own opinion about them. The last real one that they take into account is also voters, too. Just the voters that they have. You know, if you vote consistently for liberal policies, but you live in a very conservative area, those people probably aren't going to vote for you again. They're just not going to vote for you. If you vote for certain things that are you live in a very liberal part of the country, but you vote consistently against liberal policies, you probably aren't going to get voted on. If you're in the middle of the road, you got to kind of really play a very fine line between what you vote for and what you vote against. Re-election is key in any sort of legislative branch. If you get elected over and over again, the more power you are probably going to hold, because it shows that you have some sort of electability in the district that you are voting in. And you can also have a national profile. It means you want to hold power. It means that you really do like working in this environment and that you can hold and wield some power. The more you are reelected, the more influence and power you're going to have. When you're a baby freshman in Congress, very rarely are you going to come out of the gate and just have a tremendous amount of power to wield. It happens very rarely, but when it does, sometimes it can hurt you in the long run. The more power you have, the more visibility you have. The more profile you have, the more times you're going to be on a political talk show. You're going to be able to work your way up into the power structure of whatever party that you have. It equals visibility, and that, more than likely, if you have more visibility, the more incumbency you're going to have, the more that you are going to be consistently voted into office. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. People say that no press is bad press, but overall, I feel like mostly for the most part, if you are visible and out in the public, you probably are going to have a good shot at getting elected. You can use that legacy that you build on the lower offices to run for higher office. You see this a lot. Sometimes that if you're a congressperson, you can run for Senate eventually. Sometimes you can run to be a senator of the state that you're in. This happened for a lot of people, that they ran for some sort of lower office and ended up becoming senator because they ran for that and they paid their dues. When you become a senator, you can use that higher office to go into being a secretary of whatever, secretary of state, secretary of treasury. A lot of senators become secretaries of something when a new administration comes in. Money is an absolute key factor for recognition and visibility. The more money that you raise, the more likely you are going to be put on certain national talk shows because you have that profile and people want to see you and want to donate to your campaign. And you are usually fundraising from day one. This is part of the life of a congressperson, is raising money and making sure that they have money in their back pocket and also for the party as well. The next influence that they really have is lobbyists. We talked a little bit about this before, but does a legislator represent a lobby before Congress? There is some case to this too when we're talking about mass shootings in the United States right now, that a lot of people are saying that Congress people are beholden to like the NRA, who raise a lot of money, especially for conservative members who really do believe that there should not be any background checks on anybody who has any firearm. And people are starting to question whether that is okay for them to be putting that before maybe the needs and the safety of their own people. A lobbyist is there to kind of influence and try to push a senator or congressperson's vote towards a certain type of bill, and they try to influence and see how that they're going to vote. They used to, pre-1990, really they used to be able to go to different junkets like defense contracting junkets and things like that, being able to raise a ton of money for themselves. They go on vacations and maybe have some perks, but there was a lot of reforms in the 1990s where they weren't allowed to do that stuff anymore. And it's much more regulated than it used to be. But lobbyists used to spend money on congresspeople and just let them go somewhere, fly in a private jet. But now we have senators who have actually been tried over in the last couple of years who flew in a private jet without knowing maybe that they were flying on a really rich billionaire's jet, and people accuse them of being influenced by that billionaire. This happens quite often. I mean, you have to make sure that you are not influenced, quote unquote, by a lobbyist. But now we have super PACs, which really allow people to make donations anonymously from any source that they want to. And they're allowed to make these donations because they donate however much they want, and private corporations can do it. So there's a lot of money being thrown around in campaigns that are anonymous, and you don't really know where it comes from and who is influencing and talking to congresspeople. You can't monitor them all the time, but you try to influence them in certain ways. Again, money is absolutely the key factor in anything, almost anything, but especially when you run for Congress. Congress people actually have to spend time on a phone in a phone bank where they call different billionaires, rich people, and try to get money from them. This happens quite often where you will see people get on a phone and just say, hey, can you donate however much to my campaign? Some billionaires can just afford it. They're like, whatever. This is part of their job, is just to raise money, to go out there, and they have to hit a certain amount of donation marks in order to make sure that they can get money from the party too. The more money that you make, the more likely you are going to have money pumped into your own campaign. And even some congresspeople are so influential. Like, for example, Nancy Pelosi is a very good raiser of money. She makes so much money for her party, but she lives in a very safe San Francisco district. It's super liberal. So she doesn't really need to run, quote unquote, for office anymore. She barely puts out any posters, anything like that. She doesn't really run a campaign. She just puts her name on it and people vote her in because she has so much power and influence that she doesn't need to do that. Any money that she raises usually goes to other campaigns who they know need help, and will give them money based off of how they feel the likelihood of whether they're going to win or whether they actually need that to keep her majority. I mean, part of her whole run was to be Speaker of the House for a good long time, and she was once Speaker of the House, then Minority Leader, and then became Speaker again. And we'll talk about why those offices are so influential. As I said before, in the 1990s, there was a lot of reforms. Congress tightened the rules so that lobbyists can't even buy you dinner. Like, they can't do anything. And they now have ethics committees as well that will now prosecute and violate the conduct of an investigation. There really hasn't been that many reforms since 1994. The thing that happens a lot, though, it's called the revolving door syndrome. And at the beginning of the class, I showed you that video of the guy, if Congress was your coworker, which is a great video. But he says at one point, the guy with the fire, he's like, well, he gave me money and he might give me a job after I leave here too. That happens quite often, that when a congressperson leaves, they're kind of desirable. You were a congressperson. That's a pretty good portion of your resume where you can put it and go get a really good job. This is where they make their money. They can go work for a lobbying firm. They can work for any sort of PAC, maybe anything that they can help raise money and be political. they've made hopefully some connections that they can go off and really influence how people think about stuff. That's where it's called the revolving door syndrome, that people who leave Congress end up going to very private firms because they've done their time in public office, that this is where they go make their money, that they go and make their money in other ways by being influential and helping whoever that they're working for. And those people usually have a lot of money to spend. The party is also accountable. The people are also accountable to the party. That is, leadership gives assignments and committees to people. The chairmanships that people have also gain visibility, especially as chair people have become much more prominent under the Trump administration because of what they are doing or not doing. They give some sort of visibility to them to either go and pursue impeachment charges on President Trump, or maybe even some ethics violations. Whatever it is, that chairmanship usually holds and wields a lot of power. Your ability to also bring votes to your own legislation is really important from other votes that you have in Congress. If you are making a piece of legislation, you have to make connections for people where they can go and support your bill. Term limits. And another thing that I really want to make clear, there are no term limits to Congress. Unlike running for president, you can run for Congress as many times as you want or you are voted in. You really can run. People have even lost their congressional job and they came back a couple years later and ran for it again and won it back for whatever reason. Like either the redistricting happened or something else happened. Like you can run for your seat again if you wanted to. The way you kind of are voted out of office, there are a couple ways that can happen. Either you lose your accountability to the party, so the party starts supporting you. Sometimes the people in your state, their demographics change. This happens a lot to people who think that they're very safe. There's people who might really not like that congressperson because their visibility is really bad. For an example, this guy named Stephen King in Iowa is an abject racist. Has said things that are terrible about people of color, about gay people, about all this other stuff that they really just are. He's a horrible, horrible person. But he continuously gets voted in because he's in a very safe Republican Iowa area. And especially in Iowa, that's a really hard state to, it's kind of like a 50-50 whether you can get voted in or not. But last election cycle, in the 2018 election cycle, he was almost voted out of office. And it's because he is saying such horrible things that people are starting to realize, wow, this is a really bad look for us. And he's starting to lose influence in the party. He's lost certain committee memberships. He's lost a lot of recognition because of just how abjectly racist he is. And even more so than some people in politics. And the question really just becomes, should we have term limits? And there is some argument to that. But when you have a system that is based off of leadership ability and being reelected over and over again, it's really hard to come up with an idea for term limits that doesn't kind of affect that system. So whether you should put a new system in is a really good question, but there's a really good potential that you can get voted out of office after 2 years. It's hard to come up with that same concept that like, oh yeah, like, you know, we'll just find a new leader. Like, but maybe a leader, the most visible ones have been in office for, 20 plus years. And maybe there's a reason for that. But so this is kind of a really hard discussion to have about what are the term limits for Congress and what should we allow people, how often should we allow them to serve? The life of a congressman. We don't really talk about this too often, but you have to remember that being a congressman, you are often away from your family. It's first off long days. You are not only legislating, but you're going to dinners and you're raising money. You spend weekends doing this as well. You might go home on the weekends. So there's a lot of Congress people who will fly out. They fly home Monday, or they fly into Washington, D.C. on Sunday or Monday night. They work for 4 days, and then they go home on Friday. And it's really hard. I mean, for people who live in California, they're flying home every weekend to see their families because they have to live sometimes in that state that they live in. So if they can't all move to D.C., and their family is often just like at home, but they're not there during the week. They often have a bi-coastal life. That's a really hard way to live. And so this causes a lot of issues. This is why you hear people getting into trouble in Congress because they're often lonely. Sometimes Congress people will live together too. That one of them will rent an apartment and then will often like crash on somebody else's couch. Alexandra Ortiz-Carrasco, who's a congresswoman from New York, who's only 5 days older than I am. I'm like 30, and she's 30 years old, and she was a waitress just a couple of years, like 2 or 3 years ago. And she really had to like struggle the first couple months because she wasn't making a lot of money, at least not enough to live in New York and in D.C. And I don't know what her living situation is now, but there are a lot of Congress people that this happens to, that they get really in a situation where they have to all live together and band together and try to find a place where they can all stay. This is why you often hear of congresspeople quitting, because they just spend most of their time fundraising and going off to conventions and speaking and then going back to legislate and then, going home maybe for a little bit to rest. This is why they get long recesses, because it can be really taxing and really hard. Sometimes that congresspeople are also running for other offices too while they're still doing their job. So it's, again, not exactly an easy job, especially if you don't live close by. It can be really taxing for people. We're not even close to being done. The House of Representatives and how it's structured, how it actually works. The initial structure of the House of Representatives go Speaker of the House. This is the highest position that people can have in the House of Representatives. There's the Majority Leader, Minority Leader. There are the whips, committee chairs, and then the members themselves. Again, there are 435 people in the House. So the first office, the big one, Speaker of the House. They are elected, the Speaker is elected at the beginning of each Congress by the entire House of Representatives. Traditionally a member of the majority party. They are mostly in the majority. It takes some time to whip up the votes for them to get into office. Usually this person is the head of the party and the representative of that majority party. And they are the third in line for the presidency too. It's a really important role. They're the only other person besides the vice president to be actually named in the Constitution as a person who will take over the presidency if something were to happen to the vice president or to the president. Their speaker role is to preside over the House of Representatives. So the normal everyday business, that's part of their job. Are they there? Not often. They usually delegate somebody to do that, but that is part of their office role. They appoint members to each committee chair. In a committee, there's different committees in the House of Representatives, but they assign a person to chair that they have the majority, and so they allow people to gain some access to, it's usually people who have been in Congress for a good amount of time, but they give them those roles in those committee chairs in order to make sure that they can pursue certain legislation that usually some legislation starts in a committee. They're the first person that goes through the speaker. They refer bills to committees as well, so they have to make sure that when a bill comes to them, they refer it to a committee for them to discuss it and vote on it and see if it will come to the House floor. They are the representative of the people to the executive branch. So when the president comes to the Capitol, usually the speaker will be there to be the speaker for the Speaker of the House to the executive branch. And they influence the national agenda. They set forth the bills, the laws, everything that's going to come forward. They're kind of the point person that, at least for the House of Representatives, they're going to set the legislative agenda for whatever term that they serve. The second role is the Majority Leader. And this is the elected leader of the party controlling the most seats in the House. They are usually the second in command to the Speaker. So the Majority Leader does hold a significant amount of power that they are able to wield, but the Speaker of the House is the most influential. The Majority Leader is there to kind of being the backup, that they represent the actual party and aren't just the Speaker for the entire House. They are the voice for their party. So when the president addresses Congress, they are the voice for their party. They have legislation duties to make sure that they can pass certain legislation and push it through. They are presumed next for the speakership. So if something were to happen to the Speaker, this happens quite often, that the Speaker of the House is either voted out or just they don't want to have them back. The Majority Leader is presumed to be the next person, but this is not always the case. Sometimes they're passed over. Majority Leader can be a weird role. It depends on the relationship that they have with the Speaker, depends on what their role is in the party. Sometimes they are just like the vote getters, that they go out there and they whip up the votes for the Speaker. Sometimes they can be a really hostile work environment between the Speaker and the Majority Leader. Kind of just depends who's in office and how much they really like each other. The Minority Leader is the elected leader of the party controlling the least numbers of seats in the House of Representatives. And they are usually the voice for their party and how their party is going to vote. Minority Leader can hold just as much power as the Majority Leader or the Speaker of the House. And they are the voice for the party in presidential addresses, legislation, and often voices of opposition party priorities. So they don't set the agenda, but they can still hold a lot of influence because they will often speak out against the majority party and saying, we don't like how they're voting for this. This is ridiculous, and we're going to vote against this. Can they get some people on their side from the majority? Sure, that happens quite often sometimes. The minority party really doesn't do much. I mean, like, they kind of are there just to voice their opposition to certain things. They hold some power, but I mean, if you're in the majority, you have a pretty decent job. Sometimes if you need 2/3 of the House to vote on something, they can hold more power because they can try to make sure that they're going to tell certain members, don't vote for whatever the majority party is voting for. But that really, it's rare that you have a really big ability to control that. So under the majority leader and minority leader are the whips. The whips are an interesting role because they whip up the vote for votes for the members. So if they have a bill that's coming through, they're usually the person who's like, all right, well, we're not going to fund your whatever if you don't vote for this. Or, they kind of have to be a little bit of a hard ass almost, that they are the ones who are forcing the vote and how a person is going to vote and a member is going to vote by using their influence of that and seeing how many people they need to pass a bill sometimes. They are the lowest ranking of the leadership positions, and the power depends on the person. Sometimes a whip is just like a person who's there, doesn't really do much, because the Speaker of the House is such a powerful influence. Again, it kind of depends on the relationship. Sometimes that whip can just be a really long-serving congressperson who really doesn't have much influence over the whole party themselves, but they get the vote. They get what they're supposed to get, and sometimes they are that like vote getter, that they're going to force their members to vote for certain things or get people from the other parties to vote a certain way. The next tier are committees. And there's a couple different types of committees. One, they're standing, and this represents traditional ongoing areas of operation of Congress. So some of these committees are appropriations, budget, judiciary, foreign affairs. A standing committee is one that they're going to need it all the time. There are constantly issues about this, and oversight is needed from Congress about budget concerns, about judicial issues, about foreign affairs issues. And they can call certain people to come testify to their committee. Proposed bills are referred to standing committees before they go on to the House vote. Then there are joint committees. This consists of members from both parties. Its functions include special investigations and projects, etc. Russian meddling was one of the joint committees that they made, that Democrats and Republicans were concerned about this, so they made a joint committee putting certain members on it in order to make sure that they had and could ask questions to certain people. Terrorism was another one. And right after 9/11, they made another joint committee in order to make sure that there were people on there who can ask questions about what happened. The 9/11 Joint Commission is one of those things that people wanted some answers, and they did investigations from Congress to figure out what happened, why it happened, and what the influences were after that. There's also, the last one is called Ad Hoc Committee, which is a temporary committee designed to deal with specific issues. They can and are usually bipartisan. The most common Ad Hoc Committee is a Presidential Inauguration Committee, and they are just putting together all the things for the inauguration and what go into that, the planning, all that stuff. Two key committees are, one is the Rules Committee, and that's controlled by the majority power. It determines the rules of the time and debate for amendments of each bill. So they set forth different rules and debates that they're going to have on each bill, that if there's certain parts that the people, the members don't like, they can talk about it and see if they want to take certain things out or add certain things, to basically just making changes before it gets onto the floor. And then there's a Conference Committee, which is the role is to make bills match or hold prior to submitting to the president. So the Senate could have a different version of one bill and the House can have another, and they can make a conference committee that will determine how they're going to go forward with the bill before it actually goes to the president and what it's going to look like. Committee structure and what goes into that. First, there's the chairs, and the chair of the committee usually is a member of the majority party. They're appointed by the speaker or majority leader, and they decide. Well, it's a really powerful position because it could be really visible for some members of Congress. If they want certain members to have more of a voice in Congress, they will usually give them committee members. For those who they really don't like in the majority, even there's people who are in the majority that are in their party who they don't like or don't appreciate how they think about certain things, so they kind of don't give them those positions sometimes. They want certain people to be the vision of the party of going forward. Traditionally, they are the longest serving member in the subject area that they have been in. So it's no longer true in some cases, sometimes that they don't usually go to the older members of Congress who have been in a committee for a very long time. Sometimes they will go to the younger ones who they feel have a really good chance of becoming on a national stage. Now, usually it relies on the person who wants power to hold higher office and extend party visibility. The more that you can push your agenda and your party visibility, the more likely you're going to be given that powerful chairmanship role. Their powers include a couple different things. They may choose to or not schedule hearings so they can kill a bill outright. If there's a bill that somebody presents and if they don't like it, they can kill that bill automatically in the committee. They can appoint subcommittees and chairs during their committee. They cannot call a debate on certain bills, or they can call certain timing of debates. There's budget and office space for staff, so they determine who's going to have what budget space and what a budget and office space for certain things that they think are priority. If a chairman drafts a piece of legislation, that can really have more visibility in their own chair and their own party. And they also have policy pronouncements and influence on what is going to happen and the agenda of Congress and what that's going to look like. If the chairman doesn't agree with something from the Speaker of the House, that could really derail how the Speaker's own position on certain things. So they have to kind of make sure that the party is in line with what they're going to do, and they have to talk to their chairs and see that they're all on the same page. There's also a vice chair, which is the member of a minority party, and they try to work with or work against the chair. So a vice chairman has a lot of power to kind of influence how that chairmanship is going to go. They can make their life really tough. They may have similar priorities. Honestly, most of the time, some congressmen have similar priorities that are really, really in line with each other. And this happens quite often on things that they really agree on, but the things they disagree on sharply, they're going to have different agendas. It's a balance working in bipartisan fashion while promoting party agendas. So this really is a huge balancing act between how are things going to look. The last ranking of this is the members themselves. So if you do not have a leadership position or you don't have a chairmanship, you then are assigned to your own committee. So you can be on a committee and be a really new freshman, but usually you are assigned based off of what your experiences are and what your preferences are. You can let the speaker know, I'd like to be on this committee and be a part of this because I think this could be really influential for me, or I don't like this committee. So usually they try to go with what your influences and what your preferences are. They usually look for experience in education sometimes as a factor. Like if you have a lot of influence in education and foreign affairs, they're probably going to put you into the foreign affairs committee because that is a way to use your talents to your advantage. If you were a doctor, you're probably going to go into like the science committee or to different committees that might have to do with medical things. That might be a really good influence for you to have there. There's something called a pork barrel committee, and that committee is usually ideal because they allow money to flow and jobs to flow into your district. If you have a lot of money coming in, which is basically what it means, pork barrel, the more money and influence you have, the better jobs that you have, the more likely you are going to be voted in. That you can turn to the people who voted for you and say, I got you more jobs and I got a bill that got a ton of people here and our economy is better than ever. That can impact your reelection. If you aren't really trying to vote for the betterment of your district and there's no real proof that you've done that, you could be pretty easily voted out. So members have their own assigned committees, and usually at least for the House of Representatives, they get about 2 committees that they are on and are working on a constant basis. Next up is the Senate. And the structure of the Senate really goes the vice president, the president pro tempore, majority leader, minority leader, whips, and committees. So there's a little bit of a different power structure than in the House of Representatives. The Senate is a gentleman's club. I mean, really, that is the best way to say it, even though there is more women senators than there ever have been. It is still a very gentlemanly type of place where the House is considered this raucous, kind of very loud and boisterous. The Senate is considered the hall of great debate. There's more of a perception of power in the Senate because senators serve longer, and also they tend to have more influence. Their vote means more. There's only 100 of them. So their vote means more to the overall structure of the Senate and their influence. They have a couple of different roles. One is to advise and consent. That not only are they there to make laws, but they have to advise and consent on certain parts of the legislative agenda. That they make appointments that when the president has an appointment that they want to make either to their secretary, to their cabinet, or onto the judicial branch, the Senate is the one that decide. They advise and consent on the appointments that the president makes. And if they don't find that that person is going to be a good fit, they can not vote them into office. So they have much more power than the House does. The House doesn't vote on any sort of appointment, only the Senate does. They also advise and consent on treaties. So if a president signs a treaty, that's not officially law until it goes through the Senate, and the Senate has to have a full committee talking about what that treaty is going to entail and the implications of it, and they can advise and consent to that treaty. They also adhere to the impeachment process. They are a big part of that, and we're going to talk about why that is, but they are a big part of that impeachment process. The vice president is the first power structure. Usually, though, the vice president doesn't hold that much influence and power in the Senate. They are just the figurehead for the most part. They are the president of the Senate, and this is the current vice president of the United States. Mostly their stuff is procedural. If there's a 50-50 split in the deciding vote, they are the vote that is the deciding vote factor. Then there's a president pro tempore. This is also a procedural role, and it takes over for the vice president in his absence, so they are the ones that are next in line when the vice president is out. This is traditionally the longest serving member of the Senate, so this can mean a whole bunch of different things, but he's usually the person who has served in the Senate the longest because they have earned that right. The next ranking, and really the first non-procedural role, is the majority leader, and they are the voice for the majority party. They set the Senate agenda for the year, for the term, whatever it is. They set a big agenda, and they can be a really big influence in Washington. Often seen as the bad guy both in and out of the party, because there's a lot of people who don't like the majority leader and what their agenda is, even if they're in their own party. And especially if you're in the minority, you really don't like the majority leader sometimes. They hold a lot of influence to who's going to be on certain committees, what's going to happen, how they're going to look, what the legislative agenda is going to look like in the Senate. They hold a big party line down sometimes for what people are going to vote on and how they're going to vote. The minority leader is the voice for the minority party, so they are the next person in line. They voice opposition to whatever legislative agenda the majority leader usually goes for. And the power depends on how close the majority is. So the minority leaders in the party, when it's a really close, like if it's 51 senators in the majority party to 49 senators in the minority party, if they just get one vote from the majority, they can really influence how the vote is going to go. And they can set their agenda how they feel. The power of the minority is really important in the overall legislative community. It really does depend on how close the majority is in the Senate. It matters much more than in the House. The majority line can be really influential in the Senate. They also have whips. So under the majority and minority leaders, they have whips under them who all whip the vote. And this is the same role that they have in the House. Their power depends on who is in power and how powerful the minority leader and majority leader are. They can sometimes be really influential because there's only a certain amount of people that they have. They don't have as many influences as the whip does in the House. Committees are similar to the House too, so that's the next after the whips. The senators usually get much more committee assignments, but it all depends on how many assignments that they have, what they're going to do, and what those committee assignments are. You have much more visibility on a committee for the Senate than you do in the House. The House has a lot of power, but the Senate has even more power as committee members because you can vote in certain people to certain offices in the executive branch. That gives you much more influence and power, much more visibility. There's usually less arguing in the Senate than there is in the House. That has not traditionally been that way over the past couple of years, but traditionally it tends to be more of a hall for debate, and they tend to actually talk to one another and have more influence with each other personally than they do in the House. So this, again, depends on the people, depends on the amount of power and visibility that each senator has. They just have more influence usually. All right, we got 2 more sections, people. We're almost done. I promise we're almost there. Next is how a bill becomes a law. And I'm just going to put up a chart right here that will show a whole bunch of stuff. But this is basically the process of how it works. A bill is introduced in the House or in the Senate. It could start in either one. Clerk gets the bill, and there's a clerk in both the House and the Senate, and it starts with them. This clerk then sends that bill to the Speaker of the House. The bill is referred to committee or to subcommittee, and depending on who it's supposed to go towards and what that subcommittee or committee is doing. The majority leader and the chair discuss usually how the bill is going to, what's going to happen with the bill, where it's going to start, how it's going to start, all that stuff. The process starts in the committee, and it starts with, is the bill desired? And this is a yes or no question. There's usually an investigation of all facets of this bill. What are the costs, the impact, the agenda? Does it fit the agenda of the majority party? They look at a whole bunch of different factors of how this could really affect what they're going forward to. And the process really starts with hearings, and they hear on all sides of the issue that are presented. There are revisions to a bill. They make additions, they make changes, modifications based on what they hear in the hearings to try to remedy some of the problems that they can find with this. It then goes to committee for a full discussion and then for a vote. If it passes that committee, whatever one they decide to go towards, then it's sent to the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee attaches a certain amount of things for this bill. They attach a calendar on which they think that it's going to go through certain phases. They then add a calendar for debate and when the debate on this bill is going to take place in the House, when they're going to, how they're going to do amendments and how amendments are going to be attached, and they make other considerations. So the Rules Committee, every bill runs through them, and the Rules Committee sets that agenda for that bill. Let's say a bill started in the House of Representatives. They'll debate in the House of Representatives, and then they'll vote. And if there's a majority vote of basically 50% or 50% above, then if there's a majority vote for there, then it's sent to the other chamber. So let's say it then goes to the Senate. The same sort of thing, that it goes to the majority leader, and the majority leader decides with the committee chair how that is going to be processed. They have hearings on it, they make revisions, they go to the committee votes on it, and then it's sent to the Rules Committee for them to then go through the same process. And then it is voted on, and let's say that bill passes also with a 51 votes, let's just say that. Then it goes to a conference committee. The conference committee is a mixture of both the House and Representatives and the Senate. And this is a whole committee that basically puts these two bills together. They could look different because the Senate might have made a bunch of revisions that the House also made. And then that's where they decide on how this bill is going to look and what it's going to look like, what revisions are going to go forward. If the bill looks the same, then they're going to send it right to the president. If it looks different from both of them, they need to then go back to the House that it really looks very different from, and they have to go through that same process and vote that back in because they need to vote on this bill and the changes that are made to it. So this can take some time, that they revise it, they look through a bunch of different things, and then they could come back together again. It is then sent to the president. The bill is then sent to the president. That's sign it, veto it, no signature, pocket veto, and then signing a statement are all different options that the executive branch has. The Senate has a certain amount of rules that are different from what the House has, and how much debate is allowed to take place on certain bills. The Senate has parliamentary rules control, and that is a request for more information, which has been effective to removal of the debate and vote until the senator is informed on what information they need. It signals a doubt in the bill, almost like a veto, basically. And lastly, the most important one, and one that we're really going to discuss, is the filibuster. And it's a formal way of halting debate by any means by means of long speeches or unlimited debate. And senators can talk about anything they want. And senators may yield the floor, not frequently used too often. There are some examples of people filibustering and being really successful about killing a bill. Sometimes they end up losing it because they can't do it anymore. Sometimes they don't have enough support for that. But filibusters are quite common. It becomes a very influential way of a senator making a case for what they believe is right or wrong. There's a very good chance, though, that this is going to be completely eliminated within the next couple years. By the time that people watch this, it might have been eliminated also. I mean, it's just not something that people really like anymore. But this is a way to kind of protect against the power of the majority being overruling the minority party all the time. Filibusters used to happen, appointments for the president, that if a president had somebody for a secretary position that they wanted, they had to get 60 votes sometimes, because in order to override a filibuster, you need 60 votes in order to do that. And if you don't have the ability to override that filibuster, they can just keep speaking over and over again and yield it to somebody else, and then they can just kill a bill eventually. It's a way of protecting against majority control. And there usually has to be, again, a wide margin in order for you to kill a filibuster. It's the only means of dissent being heard. So really, if you get rid of the filibuster, you give the minority power almost no power to do this kind of stuff. But it can really be a hindrance to how the Senate functions. Some people argue for and against it, that it's going to be a good thing if we get rid of it, but there's some things that it might do that really impact how the Senate functions, and why it's been why it's been so different from the House. Is that the House just has a majority and that's it. With the Senate, it gives some power to the minority party to have influence. There have been numerous threats over the years to outlaw this process, but now it actually seems like this could be something that actually happens, that they actually get rid of the filibuster within the next couple of years. I don't know how long, but we'll see. And the way that you end a filibuster is called a cloture, and that's a Senate Rule 22. It's a mechanism to end the filibuster. You need 16 signatures to sign a motion for cloture, and then 60 votes to officially end the filibuster. That's the only way that you can override it. That's why you need 60 votes, usually in the majority, to speak your mind or to make sure that that filibuster is heard. But It's not often that there's 60 people in the House to have a supermajority in order to do that. It's good and bad, I think. I don't know. We'll see if this actually does happen. I don't know if it will. Again, the powers of Congress really come down to this. They have congressional oversight over a bunch of different things. The judicial and the executive branch both kind of adhere to the legislative. They make appointments to both, and really they have control over both. This is the people's house, and they are there to advise and consent to congressional oversight and to the checks and balances of really powerful branch in the executive, but also in the judicial. The last thing that we're going to talk about for the legislative branch is impeachment and how an impeachment process goes. And I'm probably going to put up another chart that shows the impeachment process and what that looks like. This might be important. I don't know if our current president, as of this filming, will be impeached, but there's a better chance than in the past. So we're going to just talk about it and make sure you guys know exactly how this works and what it means. Impeachment doesn't necessarily mean automatically. If somebody's impeached, that does not necessarily mean that they are removed from office. They have to go through a couple different processes before that actually becomes an official thing. So there has to be, at first, a resolution and basically an inquiry into impeachment. That means, is there some crime committed by, let's say it's the president, is there some crime committed by the president that is a suspicion of a crime? So the suspicion of the crime is set to the Judiciary Committee, which then will go into an investigation. And then they have a full debate, and there's a vote by committee. And that says, if yes, there are hearings on whether to go forward on an impeachment hearings. This means that due process rules apply, that when that the person accused is allowed due process under the law to try to make their case heard, that they are allowed to bring witnesses, that they are allowed to have a full debate, that this is basically a full criminal investigation trial. And then they need to come up with articles of impeachment, which are adopted by a vote, and the articles are voted upon by the Judiciary Committee and sent to a full House with a report. So as of right now, there is Judiciary Committee articles that are being voted on, or at least being drafted up potentially by the Judiciary House. They're investigating right now, and there is debate on whether they should bring forward an articles of impeachment. The Rules Committee defers to the Speaker on the length of the debate. The Rules Committee, which usually sets out the debates for everything, defers to the Speaker on the length of the debate. So the Speaker sets the tone for how long impeachment inquiries are going to go for. And then this goes to the House vote. Once the House has debated over the impeachment inquiry, then they go to a full House vote on the floor. If it passes, a yes vote means the president has been impeached and a trial is to commence. So at this point, the president has been impeached, but they have not been fully removed from office. They are allowed a trial under the law to make their case, and a trial commences after this point. So, for example, President Andrew Johnson went to a full trial and was found not guilty. In fact, Andrew Johnson escaped with just one vote. Like, he barely made it off of that. He was almost officially impeached and be the first president to ever have that happen to him. Nixon, for example, did not even get impeached. He was removed from office he removed himself from office before he even got to that point. But it was looking like he was going to be impeached and then tried, and there was a pretty good chance he was going to be removed from office. And instead of going through that embarrassment and putting through the country through that, he decided to then just officially resign. The trial of the president is in the Senate. So the Senate is the jury. They are the ones who decide fully if the president is guilty or not. They are the ones who decide whether the president is guilty or not. The House Judiciary Committee is the one where things started from. They are the representatives of the people. So they are almost like the plaintiffs, basically, that they're suing and trying to remove the president from this. And the president can defend themselves. The president is represented by full counsel with full due process. This is a full-on trial, and they are allowed to bring people before to testify, to bring whatever pieces of evidence that they have, whatever that might look like. The Chief Justice then sits in judgment. The Chief Justice of the United States, the judicial branch, is the primary judge. They are the judge of it all. And once the trial is done and they've gone through the whole due process, there's a full vote in the Senate. They have to have 2/3 of the senators agree for removal. So it needs to be 67 senators who vote yes to remove the president from their office. And officially after that point, the president is removed, and the vice president or whoever else is in office at that point is then put into that position of power. They are then the next successor in line. I don't know if that will ever happen, but we will see. I mean, it sounds very unlikely right now, and there could be something that comes up eventually that, happens, but it would be an absolutely insane thing to watch. No matter who was in office, it would be in full indictment of whatever president was in power, and I don't know who would want to put themselves through that. That's why Nixon left, because he would not want to face something like that. The full government just basically involved and wrapped up in what would be the biggest story of the century, probably. That is it. I am so tired and my voice is starting to die, so I'm glad that we finished this. That's the legislative branch. It is a ginormous, huge part of our government, and it is probably the single most important branch of our government. You also have another video to watch. Unfortunately, watch that another day. Don't watch it right now. Just watch enough of this. Go watch the other one, which is about the current leadership and the important people in Congress. We're going to go right into that too, and to see what that's like and what people are influential right now in Congress and fill these leadership positions that we just talked about. So go watch that video as well. I am going to go take a nap because I am very tired. I will see you all in the other video, and then next week when we talk about the last branch, which is the executive, and we're going to talk all about that. So thanks, guys. I will see you later. Have a good week.